The Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private away from the crowd and put his fingers into his ears. And he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And his ears were opened, his tongue released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Sounds a little bit like Jesus didn't read James. If you show partiality, you commit sin. But of course, that's an anachronism. Jesus would have no occasion to have read James, a book written many years after his lifetime. But surely he was familiar with the Psalms, which sing of a God, as we just did, who gives justice to those who are oppressed and food to those who hunger, who sets the captive free, who cares for the stranger and sustains the orphan and widow. And certainly he would have been familiar with the Torah, the instructions of God given through Moses to the Israelites long ago, the bedrock of his Jewish faith and practice. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus says only 5 chapters later in Mark, holding up the second half of the greatest commandment. Itself not an original thought, but going as far back as Leviticus, a book which also reminds the Israelites, Jesus' ancestors in faith, only a few verses later in that very same chapter, when an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress them. You shall love them as yourself. So what's going on with Jesus' response here to this Gentile woman of Syro-Phoenician origin, this foreigner who Jesus calls a dog? Preachers and scholars confronted by this indeed perplexing, if not disturbing text, usually offer 2 possible interpretations for what's going on. One possibility, Jesus said what he said on purpose, not because he actually believes this woman to be a dog, subhuman or lesser, but in order to provide an object lesson of sorts, to challenge the conventional thinking of his day and to expose it for the hateful rhetoric that it is. Or Jesus, fully human as he was, succumbed to that conventional thinking himself. Jesus messed up, and this woman challenges him, changes his mind, converts him, and opens him up to a more expansive view of God's love and care. So which is it? Jesus, the teacher, with the well-intentioned, if not a little problematic object lesson that ends up exploiting a foreigner and a woman to prove a point, or Jesus the bigot, who at least initially is no better than anyone else around him and who gets called out by someone who refuses to put up with his harmful words? If you're waiting for me to give you the answer, I'm sorry to disappoint. Maybe we don't have to choose, though. Actually, maybe we can't choose. Ask anyone who has ever engaged in a war of comments on social media. You can't read tone through the written word. And so Jesus' meaning remains this eternal enigma. Mark doesn't tell us, and none of us, of course, was there to hear it. Maybe choosing, though, also misses the point. Just because we're reading the Gospels doesn't mean it always has to be exclusively about Jesus. There are other people here. Here is a woman, unnamed, a foreigner, an outsider, a woman who is bold and courageous, who doesn't timidly knock at the door, waiting to be acknowledged and let in, but who barges in full force immediately, announces herself, and pleads her case at the feet of Jesus. Here is, as one commentary succinctly puts it, a radiant model of bold, creative, resourceful faith. And further elaborates, a faith that puts first things first, a daughter's health, for instance, that marshals every resource available, that seeks God out with vim and vigor, and is finally unafraid to wrestle, to strive, and to struggle with God. This faith, in a phrase, is a verb. Faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. That's an interesting one from a Lutheran perspective, isn't it? Ours is a religious tradition founded on this very principle that we are saved not by the works we do, but by grace alone, and that's true. And yet Luther himself is quick to remind us of the importance of a faith active in love. Our faith is an active, living, breathing, working, marching, shouting, voting sort of thing. God's work, our hands, working together, building a future, repairing the world. God's work, our feet, traveling together, following Jesus, marching for freedom. God's work, our voice, singing together, praying for peace, shouting for justice, claiming God's love for the lost and the least. This is faith active in love, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to relentlessly seek God out, to trust in what Jesus is capable of, to be bold and daring, confident in the love of a God who shows no partiality, who fiercely and unconditionally loves us, and who compels us to do and be the same. Faith is a verb, the Syro-Phoenician woman reminds us and courageously shows us by her example. Faith is a verb that opens us, ephatha, that opens us to the needs of a suffering and vulnerable people, to bear witness to a God who cares deeply and who calls us to join them in their creative, redeeming, and liberating work for the sake of the whole creation.